Hello, everyone, and welcome to FAIR's free monthly webinar series. My name is Mike Spigler, and I'm the Vice President of Education for FAIR. I will be your moderator today, and we'll be taking your questions throughout the broadcast using both the questions and chat features on the toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen. Please note that this is the only way to interact with us today, as all attendees will be muted throughout. If time permits, which I do believe it will, we'll give our presenter an opportunity to respond to questions at the end of the presentation. This presentation, as are all of FAIR's webinars, will be recorded and posted on the FAIR website in about 7 to 10 days, and I've already gotten about 10 questions that have come in just since we've started. So keep them coming. We're very thankful that this month's webinar was made possible through generous support from Quest Diagnostics. For more information on our sponsor, please visit them at www.questdiagnostics.com. But before we get started, we wanted to just find out a little bit more about kind of who the folks are that are attending the webinar today. So we've got a couple of questions we're going to bring up as polls. So why don't you just let me know kind of what best describes you. So feel free to go ahead and select one and give me your answers. So we're at about, looks like a pretty strong amount of the second age range there. Parent of child with food allergies, age 4 to 10. It's about 70% of the callers today. 68%, 14% parents of children 11 and older. 10% of parents in the very young age range, and then teachers and other about 4% each. Great. Next question is, what does your child attend? So we'd like to know, what daycare, preschool, public K through 12, private K through 12. So it looks like mostly public K through 12. Again, about 60% are public K through 12. Preschool and private K through 12 running neck and neck, about 17%. So I think mostly public K through 12. The second one, preschool, then private K through 12. This is just good for our speaker to know today. And last question. What's the biggest challenge you face in obtaining a safe and inclusive environment for your child with food allergies? So a lot of people look like they definitely need a good primer here. So most folks are saying, I don't really understand my child's rights, about 45%, 20% others. So I think we have a wide range of issues, which we certainly see in our emails and phone calls that we get here. 14% is probably the next highest, and the school does not enforce the accommodations already agreed upon, which is definitely something that we hear pretty frequently. So today's presenter is very well known in the food allergy community, and we're honored to have her be on the call today. Gina Clowes is the Director of Education for FAIR and Program Director for a Cooperative Agreement with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Active in food allergy advocacy, her advice has appeared in numerous print, radio, and television features, including CNN, People Magazine, and ABC World News. She writes a regular column, The Parenting Coach, for Allergic Living magazine, and is the author of the best-selling children's book, One of the Gang, Nurturing the Souls of Children with Food Allergies. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Gina.
Thank you, Mike. My son Daniel started preschool a few years back with over a dozen food allergies. And at that time, I did what many moms have done before me. I asked the school and the teachers to let me know when birthdays or other celebrations were going to take place so that I could provide something safe for my son. He was 3 years old at the time. One day I arrived early to pick him up, and I looked inside the classroom, and I saw 15 kids giggling and laughing. They were eating cupcakes piled high with icing and sprinkles, having a great time. And I glanced over, and I saw my son, then 3 years old, sitting by himself, eating his wheat-free pretzels and drinking his bottle of spring water. And I just wondered, how could this happen? A parent forgot to let me know that they were going to celebrate the child's birthday, and the teachers didn't have a problem handing out the cupcakes like that. So at our house, if we have 5 kids playing and only 4 popsicles, we would never dream of giving out the popsicles. but sometimes the teachers don't see things through that lens. And when teachers are not aware of how isolating food allergies can be, the school environment can be very unfriendly to kids with allergies. And school doesn't just take an emotional toll. There can be a physical risk as well. The next slide is Max Roslin. This is him at age 6. When his mom, Amy Roslin, went to enroll him in kindergarten, she asked about a 504 plan, which we'll discuss later. The school said, no, you don't need that. We have healthcare plans. We will work with you. We've handled food allergies before. So they had a more informal arrangement. The teacher would often call or text her, is this safe for Max? We're going to put this in the treat box. Is this okay for him to have? And they did that for the movie party that they were planning the day before Christmas break. So the teacher called Mrs. Roslin and said, we're planning on having popcorn and marshmallows for our movie party. Are these safe for Max? Mrs. Roslin went up there, checked the 2 snacks, and saw that they were safe for him, and she said that would be fine. The next day during the party, Amy Roslin got the call that every allergy mom dreads. Max had taken a bite of a peanut butter granola bar. On the next slide, you can see that Max ended up having to be medically paralyzed and put on a heart-lung machine to save his life. His reaction was so severe. He was in intensive care for 3 days during his Christmas break. During the break, the school called once Max was out of ICU and asked the parents if they wanted to come in and meet with the school to develop a 504 plan. Now, there are no guarantees that even with a 504 plan, things would have been completely safe, but you really can't help but wonder if having a more formal, legally binding plan would have made a difference for Max. Today, 1 in 13 children has at least one food allergy. A third of these kids have multiple allergies. That's 5.9 million kids in the United States. 40% of these allergic children have already experienced a life-threatening allergic reaction. So food allergies, it's clear, are a major public health issue, and anyone dealing with children in 2014 and beyond needs to be aware of this. The CDC, along with the Department of Education, the USDA, the Department of Justice, FAIR, and other organizations, created national guidelines that were released in October 2013. Now, you'll hear these referred to as the CDC Guidelines. Most of the specific recommendations in the guidelines are voluntary. Schools do not have to implement them exactly as they're detailed in the guidelines, except for the federal law portion. The federal laws and regulations that pertain to children with food allergies are mandatory. So we're going to review some of the highlights of the CDC guidelines and how these pertain to allergic children. One of the first things that is recommended in these national guidelines is that schools create an overall policy. They refer to this as a Food Allergy Management and Prevention Plan, FAMPP. And this is basically an overall school policy. I would recommend, though, that you keep in mind, in my experience, it's best when parents work on a plan for their own child first, an individual plan. You want that plan to be in writing. You want to make sure that the school is agreeing upon everything that is there. And once you have, and that the school is following it, and once you have that foundation set, if you have energy left over and you want to pursue working with your school on an overall policy, that will work well. Okay, the next thing that the CDC guidelines recommend is that children at risk for anaphylaxis have an individual food allergy management plan. So this is a very important part of the guidelines. Now, in public schools, where a child's food allergy constitutes a disability, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and when the child needs services, which we also talk about, services can be like a modification of the environment or accommodation, when they have a food allergy that constitutes a disability and needs services, this will typically be a 504 plan, okay? Now, in a private school, it may be called an accommodation plan. The key thing is that this plan is written. You want to make sure that it's a written plan, and then includes 2 key components. The first part are the accommodations for access. What that means is, what does the child need to be able to participate in the Christmas party? What does the child need to be able to participate safely at lunchtime? Does the child have any transportation needs? The second key component is the emergency care portion. It can be called an emergency care plan, ECP. It can be called an individual health care plan, IHCP. Some of the older terms are Food Allergy Action Plan. But in any case, this is a plan that you work on with your doctor that's set, and it's individualized for your child based on their unique medical history. And this tells us how do we recognize the signs of an allergic reaction and how do we treat them. And this will be different. So it's definitely you want to have your child's physician's input on this. So going back to the disability term, what is a disability? Well, under the law, it's a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more life activities, and you evaluate it when it's active. So in our case, as parents of food allergic children, the food allergies can affect their eating. I mean, most of our kids could never just take a cookie off the buffet table. They could also, during a reaction, affect the life activity of breathing, cardiovascular, immune system, gastrointestinal, etc. during a reaction. Disability is a loaded term, and a lot of parents may be reluctant to use that term, but really what does it mean? Disabled means unable, and our kids actually are unable to just eat any food or ingest any food, or in some cases be around food or food residue without risk of a reaction. So that word disability can actually be the key that may open the door to some of the accommodations that your child needs. We sort of have a bit still of an outdated notion that there are a variety of plans that will suffice. There could be a Food Allergy Action plan or health care plan, emergency care plan, or 504 plan. But really, the laws tell us that in public schools, when a child's food allergy constitutes a disability and that child needs services, and a service can be something as narrow as the teacher is trained to recognize the signs of an allergic reaction or anaphylaxis. When those two things are there, the disability and the child needs services, the child should be evaluated for a Section 504 plan. That is the correct reference. So the last thing is, on the same slide, is following federal law, and that's a very important part of the CDC guidelines. And if you're new to the food allergy world, you may not even be aware that federal laws and regulations are available that govern food allergies at school. But this is a very important part, and we'll have a link at the end of the presentation. But I would really encourage you, especially if you're new to this information, to look at Section 5 of the guidelines that I believe begins on page 86. So we'll go over a very high level of some of these laws that pertain to food allergies. So Section 504, which you may have heard of, the ADA and the ADA amendment are civil rights laws that have been created to enable access to students with disabilities. So Section 504, which applies to the Section 504 plan, prohibits discrimination for schools that receive federal financial assistance, which is all public schools and actually many private schools. So you may think, discrimination, what does that have to do with food allergies? So there was an example of a parent called, actually a teacher, and she was a substitute teacher, and she called FARE wanting to know what she should have done about something because a parent brought in a couple dozen of Krispy Kreme donuts. There was a child that had allergies to wheat and other things, and she wasn't sure how to handle it. So she gave out the donuts to most of the kids in the classroom, and then she took the other little boy with the allergies out in the hall, and they drank a Dixie cup of water together because she felt uncomfortable. That really, I actually was talking to a friend, an attorney, and that really is a textbook definition of discrimination. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same treat, but if treats are given out in the classroom, there needs to be something that's safe for the allergic child as well. It's not appropriate to just leave the child out. The ADA also prohibits discrimination, and that would apply to other places of public accommodation and public school. So this would apply to public schools and many private schools. The Department of Justice oversees ADA and the Office for Civil Rights under either the Department of Education or the USDA oversees Section 504. So some religious schools are exempt. It's very interesting. There are different standards under ADA and Section 504. There was an agreement between the Department of Justice, who again oversees ADA, and Lesley University when this college students with celiac and food allergies felt that they were not being accommodated. So they filed a complaint with the ADA under the ADA, and the Department of Justice came in and worked with Lesley University and came up with an agreement. And it's very interesting to see what they considered reasonable accommodations because they're quite extensive. And I would encourage you to look at that agreement and see what they made available to these students at Lesley University, because many of us would be thrilled to have that kind of accommodation even in our kids' elementary or high school. Then the ADA Amendments Act was signed in 2008 and active in 2009, and that actually broadened the interpretation of disability. So health issues that are episodic, that are not constantly ongoing, but just episodic, or you look at them to determine disability when they're active. So in our case, it would be you can determine if an allergy is a disability when it's actually occurring. And also, you don't need to consider mitigating measures. So even if you have a epinephrine auto-injector, or often even a healthcare plan is considered a mitigating measure, you need to determine disability without looking at those mitigating measures, which is something that helps us. The next one is IDEA, and this is our federal special education law. So for most of our kids, if you're, quote, only dealing with a food allergy and you're not dealing with a learning issue, the 504 in a public school will be the correct reference. However, if your child has food allergies, a medical issue, and has an issue that affects learning, then sometimes you'll have your accommodations put on what they call an IEP, an individualized education plan. But for most of us, it wouldn't be put, IDE would not apply. And the last one is FERPA, and that's the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. And I think this is very relevant because 20 years ago, when really the wave of these food allergic children began to emerge, parents had no idea how to get accommodations for their kids in preschool and when they started school. And as we know, it's terrifying when you've seen your child react and know what's at stake, to pass off the care to someone else. So parents went in and did the best they can. They sort of pleaded their case with the teacher. They often wanted to send letters to other classroom parents and said, please, if you're thinking of celebrating your child's birthday, would you think of my son? Would you consider sending something in that doesn't have peanut or milk or egg? And sometimes these parents would go in and they would read a story to the classmates, basically just trying to help and trying to see if they could get the classmates to help keep their child safe. They were not really aware that there are laws that can help protect our children. They were not really aware that our children do have a right to be included and have access to all of these activities. And so, but you should never have to disclose your child's medical condition to get the accommodations that he or she needs. Now, educating classmates is a great idea if it's coming from the teacher or the nurse or the school. But you need to think carefully about having it come from the parent, because it may be that we are inadvertently exposing our children's vulnerability to kids who may not be as compassionate or kind-hearted as what we would like. And you can't unring that bell. Once you've disclosed that, it's out there. And this is very different from having your children's friends know. That's a personal choice. That seems very appropriate. But just having a parent go in there and disclose that is a very different thing. Okay. So now we come to one of my favorite parts of the guidelines. We get a lot of questions at FAIR about, what is appropriate? What is an accommodation? Let me see a sample 504 plan or a sample accommodation plan. And I would say these are very, very individual. But these recommended practices for safety inclusion from the CDC are basically common accommodations that you will see on a 504 plan or accommodation plan. And also, another question that we get quite frequently is what happens if you are in a private school, if your school does not get federal funds. The plan can look very similar. My son has been in public school, he's been in private preschool, he was in a Montessori school for a while, and even though the plan was not a Section 504 plan in a private school, and it did not come with the procedural safeguards that the public school 504 plan did, it basically was really the similar plan. It would have the two key components, the accommodations that are needed, who is going to take care of the different accommodations, and then the emergency care plan, how to recognize and treat an allergic reaction. So with Section 504 or the ADA, IDEA, you'll see often words like related aids and services and modifications and accommodations. All of these words are different ways of saying how do we access, how do kids with allergies access the school, all the activities in school. What do they need? How do we need to tweak things for our children so that they can access the bus ride safely, the party safely, etc. Okay, so the first one is, this is one of the recommended practices from the CDC, is to avoid the use of identified allergens in parties, projects, arts and crafts, cooking, rewards. all of these. They're basically saying if there is a child in the classroom with, say, a milk allergy and a peanut allergy, those are identified allergens in that classroom. If in a different classroom it may be a red dye allergy and an egg allergy, those are identified allergens in that classroom. It's not saying avoid all allergens in every classroom because any food could potentially be an allergen. But if there's children in the classroom and their allergens have been identified, let's not include those in parties and projects and arts and crafts and cooking, etc. And we know that at least one study has showed that 79% of reactions occur in the classroom. So the classroom, and particularly any of these activities outside the norm, like a party, are very, very high risk. Often you have, parent volunteers. We've had a situation where a child with allergies asked another parent if a particular food was safe for him. Did this have peanuts? And the parent thought, well, there's no way that it was possible that a pretzel could have peanuts, when in fact it actually can. And it worked out okay that time, but it's just when you have a lot of chaos and a lot of things outside the norm, those situations create additional risk. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. And anything outside the norm, like my son is allergic to wheat, but he had played with Play-Doh. So when my son's school asked, could he participate in a table if they had wheat flour and they were playing with it, manipulating it, and doing different crafts with it, wheat flour, would that be okay? And I actually thought it would be okay because I knew he played with Play-Doh and I knew that contained wheat. When I went to pick him up, his eyes were red, and actually when I got him home and put him in the shower, his whole torso was covered with hives. So he rubbed his eyes with the wheat, and that's considered an ingestion. It's now in a mucous membrane, and he may have been breathing how much of the wheat flour that they were playing with. So it's just an example of just keeping the allergens out of the classroom may be a really wise idea. Okay, the next one is washing hands before and after handling food. So this seems pretty logical. Wipes can work also. This has actually been studied, and wipes work well. Kids are not terrific at washing their hands to begin with. Soap and water is great. Baby wipes can work. What you don't want is antibacterial gel. That just spreads the food residue. And it's not a germ, it's a food protein, so we're really not trying to kill germs. We're trying to get rid of the food protein. So actually manipulating a baby wipe or a hand wipe can remove some of that protein, but not the disinfectants or antibacterial gels. Okay, informed substitute teachers. This is another really good one. A lot of times we think about the child's main teacher and the additional teachers, but there's so much more than that. The substitute teachers can definitely be an area of high risk. I know my son, when he was in kindergarten, first grade, definitely had a really good 504 plan for him. And he came home from school one time around the holidays with a great big candy cane. And what happened was the music teacher, there was a substitute, and she was, innocently thinking she would provide a treat for all of the kids. And thank goodness it wasn't like some kind of a nut or peanut thing, which my son is allergic to. But she handed out candy canes, no ingredients. And it was just something obviously innocent, but you really need to make sure that substitute teachers are aware. At one of my son's schools, they have a list of substitute teachers who are aware. That would be who they would prefer if they know there's a classroom where there's a food allergy. Teachers who have substitutes have already been trained on how to recognize and treat anaphylaxis. But what they'll do is, if they can't get one of those teachers and they need a substitute in a classroom where there's a child with food allergies, the secretary will let the substitute teacher know as soon as they come in that they need to report to the nurse, and they go through some epinephrine auto-injector training. They go through training on recognizing the symptoms of allergic reaction or anaphylaxis, and they identify the children in the classroom on a need-to-know basis, of course, who are at risk for an allergic reaction. So that's a real important place. Okay, the next one is rapid access to epinephrine for all activities. So, you want to definitely have it on. Some kids self-carry, many kids don't. They're too young. And in this case, what happens at recess? What happens at phys ed? What happens during fire drills? You don't want you want to have immediate access to that epinephrine auto-injector. So there are lots of ways to handle this. Sometimes phys ed teachers will have a set. Some parents are able to buy multiple sets, others are not. Some schools stock epinephrine, which is wonderful and makes it very convenient. But you definitely want to make sure that when kids are far away from the nurse's office or far away from their epinephrine auto-injectors, there is a set available and someone who is trained to use it. Okay, the next one is consider allergen-friendly seating. So we've all heard of the peanut table or the peanut-free table, and this works well for some kids. A lot of times as kids get older, it doesn't work well. Sometimes there's an issue with making sure that other kids are sitting there, and definitely kids socializing is very important. There's a concept in providing a free, appropriate public education. It's called FAPE. That kids with disabilities are entitled to. Every kid with a disability, every child with a disability is entitled to a free, appropriate public education. But also you want to provide that in a least restrictive environment. So it may be that the child needs to sit at a separate table, but the child should also be socialized as normally as possible. Okay, so it's a balancing, but definitely you want to make sure that when you're working on your plan that there's something written into the plan so that your child is not sitting by him or herself. And I don't want to make like this happens all the time, but it's just something that needs to be worked out and needs to be considered. It's important to balance safety and normalcy as much as possible, and it's heartbreaking when you hear stories of kids, sitting all by themselves. So see what you can do to work with your school to make sure that your child will have someone to socialize and relax and eat lunch with. Some schools actually now are moving toward excluding the food and not the child. So in some schools, actually they do this in some of the elementary schools in my son's district. They do they separate. If you have nuts or peanuts in your lunch, you'll sit down at one end of the table, and then the kids, anyone else can sit in the other areas. In some schools, I know there's a local district here that does something called Nutty Buddies. And if you have peanuts or nuts in your lunch, that's totally fine. You just sit at a certain table. And, there's no shame in that. You can bring it if you like, but you're going to sit at a certain table. So they're, again, excluding the food and not the child. Okay, allergen-safe meal preparation in the cafeteria. So again, I would encourage you always to lean toward handling this in a more formal way. When something is important, it's written down and it's handled more formally. When you leave your doctor's office with a prescription, it's on the label how to take it. If you're going to have surgery, they give you pages of instructions that say exactly what to do, when you can eat, when you need to report. When something is important, it's written down. So there's a USDA form for meal substitutions, and you can find links to this at the end of the CDC guidelines, and we'll show you a link in a few minutes at the end of the presentation. But if your child does have a dietary disability or food allergy that constitutes a disability, you can have your doctor fill out this USDA form, and you're going to share this with your school. And meal substitutions in that case are required. The school has to provide substitutions. Now, they don't have to provide the exact same thing. That may not be possible, but they have to provide a meal substitution, and you need to pay the same price. They can't charge you more for that. Now, in some cases, it's just too difficult. Some kids are, not that it's too, they have to provide that if you want that, but in some cases, our kids may be picky or selective, or they may not like the substitutions. But if you work with a cafeteria manager, you may be able to find something that will work for you. I know I have a friend whose son has, milk, wheat, a bunch of allergies, and they determined that the taco day with rice and tacos could be safe. They have a whole system worked out. Even though it's safe, the cafeteria manager puts his aside. He goes and tells her ahead of time that he's buying today, confirms that this is in fact what they're serving, and she gets his safe price, makes his tacos first, hands it to him in line, and he feels happy. He can buy once, a week or every other week, but just for him, that's a way to be normal and included, and he really enjoys that. The cafeteria managers need to be prepared to share the labels, to share recipes, to share ingredients, to share vendors. They need to be prepared to share all this with parents. There's no way that we can make an informed decision without having all the information. And as we all know, label reading is very nuanced and complex, and so it's comforting for us to know and be able to see ourselves what is there and what is available and what precautions the cafeteria managers are taking. So this is really important for them. Okay. Bus drivers, transportation is part of the school day, a very important part of the school day. And the CDC guidelines recommend that bus drivers are trained to respond to anaphylaxis, to respond to allergic reactions. There needs to be a way that epinephrine is available. There's a lot of confusion with this issue, and sometimes schools, this epidemic is relatively new, and sometimes schools are a little bit confused, and they will try to put this back on the parent and say things like, well, we can't do that because we don't employ the bus drivers, they're contracted with us. So you want to work with them as much as you can, but it's really the district's responsibility. If your child needs to be with someone who is trained to recognize and treat anaphylaxis, then the school will have to find a way to transport your child with someone like that. In a lot of districts today, even with companies that are contracted, these drivers are being trained on how to recognize and treat anaphylaxis and respond in an emergency. Okay, and enforcing the no eating on the bus, this is a really big issue. Now we're seeing more and more cameras on buses, and this is important. This comes into play a lot too with field trips, and this is another thing that could be spelled out on a 504 plan or an accommodation plan. With field trips, you definitely want to plan ahead. So it may be that the teacher or the administrators plan that they're going to eat outside the museum in the park, but then it's raining. So it's really important that if your doctor and you determine that it's not safe for your child to be eating on the bus on a field trip if there's a lot of other foods there that your child may react to. But whatever you and your doctor spell out, you want to have these discussions ahead of time and definitely plan ahead so that the teachers and administrators have an opportunity to figure out what their plan B could be if they planned on eating outside, if eating on the bus is not a safe thing. A lot of parents also, especially if your child is in kindergarten or first grade or riding the bus for the first time, another thing that you can really spell out in your accommodation plan is, where that you will come to the bus stop on the first day, maybe introduce your child to the driver, and there may be special seating. Perhaps your child will sit in one of the first or second rows and kind of keep at that seat so the driver knows exactly where your child is in the event of something happening. Okay. The CDC guidelines also recommend that schools not exclude children with food allergies from field trips, and or also really any extracurricular activities. There was a few years back, I was working with a school, and they had a Hawaiian beach blast event, and they wrote, it was right on the flyer, that it was, they were going to serve XYZ treats, and kids with food allergies could bring a brown bag lunch, and that's just not an appropriate way to handle that. If they're providing snacks for typical children, these should be provided for all children. So it's helpful if the schools can plan a location that might be inclusive for all children. And schools can invite but should not require parents to attend field trips. And I would say this is the same thing with parties. A lot of us, especially when our kids are younger, will do anything we can to attend these events just to make sure that things are working as they should be. Others of us work and have other issues with, elderly parents or what have you, or for whatever reason are not able to. So you should be invited. The CDC guidelines recommend that parents are invited but not required. If other parents are not required to attend a field trip, if other parents are not required to attend the parties, then you should not have to do that. But it's nice if you're invited, and it really can be very, very helpful, especially in the beginning, to see where the trouble spots are, if any. Hopefully not, but you never know. So the recommended practices, I went over some of the highlights. There are many more of those in the different areas in school. If you go to foodallergy.org/CDC that you can see there, if you click on that link, you'll see a graphic that shows you the actual CDC guidelines. Don't get overwhelmed by that. It's 108 pages. What I would recommend you do is look at pages 41 to 43 first. Again, those are the recommended practices. That's what the CDC guidelines call them. These are really just common accommodations. These are things that schools routinely do to help protect children with food allergies and also so that they can have access to all school activities. There shouldn't be any more of kids, in the hall with a Dixie cup of water while the other kids are eating. Krispy Kreme donut. There needs to be a way for celebrations and all these events to be inclusive. So that I would recommend you look at those recommended practices as a place to start. The other thing I would recommend you do is that you look at Section 5, and those are the federal laws and regulations that govern food allergies in school. Very important part, especially if you're new to the food allergy world, to know, because there really are laws that are on our side, but we have to learn how to use them. Okay. So you are your child's best advocate. Sadly, a lot of times when we hear from parents and there's a near tragedy, parents will often say they didn't know. They didn't know what to do, they didn't know how to handle, and obviously there is really a lot to know and learn, but this is a very important project. So learn about the law as best you can, learn about what accommodations are available. So most kids, most allergic kids, if you think about them, you can think about them on a bell curve. Most kids will be accommodated just fine with the recommended practices that are on the CDC guidelines. But some kids, because of maybe additional issues that they may have, other health issues, maybe developmental issues, or because they've had such an extreme history of severe reactions, they may actually need more than what is included in the CDC guidelines. And when this is the case, you want to make sure that you are working with your physician, your child's physician, and that he or she will help you, recommend these additional accommodations in writing. I knew there was a boy who had very, very serious reactions, 2 of them, and was kept in intensive care, was intubated, very, very serious reactions. And so the parent worked with the school, and the school actually, he had such a reaction to such a small amount of milk that they had to go above and beyond. So the custodian would, when he would go from class A to class B, the custodian would actually wipe down the handrails in between. The custodian would wipe down his keyboard, and like what is more common, they would wipe off his cafeteria table before he sat down. But they did a little bit extra. But this was absolutely required based on this child's individual and unique medical history. Just make sure that if you're looking for more than that, that there's a reason and that you're going to have your doctor's support, because it's very tricky to get the additional accommodations if you don't have the support of your physician. So, and I also want to say, if you read online, there are definitely some heartbreaking stories of children who are not accommodated appropriately at school. But I want to tell you that for most kids, there are also heartwarming stories where schools and teachers really do get it and go the extra mile to care for kids like ours. So as you approach this with your school, go in believing that you are going to prevail and you are going to come away with a safe plan, because most people, you may not get everything you want, but if you come away with a decent plan and you have most of the accommodations that are listed in the CDC guidelines, your child will probably be just fine. There may be things that you have to work through, but chances are things are going to be okay. So even though you may hear a lot of the heartbreaking stories, in many cases that won't be you. So just think positive and believe in yourself and that you'll have a successful outcome. And so I would be happy to take some questions now, if we have some.
Thank you, Gina. And you've gotten probably more than I think I've ever seen come in before, so all good things. So the first question I have for you is, can my 504 cover events sponsored by other groups like the PTA?
Well, your 504 will cover things that happen during the school day and school-sponsored activities. So, but let's talk about the 504. So public schools, as recipients of federal funding, they have to comply with the Section 504 law. They cannot directly discriminate, but they also cannot provide significant support to any entity that discriminates. So again, I mentioned earlier, I worked with a school who did a Hawaiian beach blast, and they had this flyer where they said the PTO was going to provide ice cream and popcorn, etc., and children with food allergies can bring a brown bag. This event was held on the school premise. The school sent home flyers announcing and promoting this event. The meetings for the PTO were held on the school premise. So the school, in fact, did provide support to the PTO. So even though it was held by the PTO, the school was now supporting that. So the school cannot provide support to an entity that discriminates. So really, you could go back to the school and say, you know, this event needs to be inclusive. And you could also argue, is the PTO or PTA a place of public accommodation where ADA would apply? I have actually seen 504 plans where they actually work all events or many school events into it. But generally, you can work with your school or with the PTO and explain the situation. And like in this case, I was able to work with them. We looked anonymously at all of the kids who had allergies and special dietary needs, and we were able to come up with a few safe treats that all the kids could access for free. So we made it a little bit different. If free means free. So if an event is free for the other kids, it should be free for the kids with food allergies.
Great. Thank you, Gina. So this is a question of someone just relaying their experience. At our 504 meeting, the team agreed to work with us so my daughter could be included in parties and celebrations, but at the end of the meeting, the teacher asked for a box of safe snacks just in case something comes up. I want to be cooperative, but I'm not sure what I should do.
Okay, this is me getting on a soapbox. Okay, so when teachers ask for a safe snack box, first of all, it's you know, I do believe that it's innocent. I believe it's part of that old school way of doing things. But when you really think about it, if you work things out with your 504 and they are going to include accommodations so that your child can be safely included in all parties and celebrations, why would they need a safe snack box? Because often when teachers ask for a safe snack box, it's because they're planning ahead to accept or share food in the classroom that will not be safe for your child. So again, that's really part of the old school way of doing things. It may be done innocently. Now, that's not to say I do think that there is a reason to have a safe meal or two, a shelf-stable meal for children with food allergies. I know my son in first grade had his wheat, dairy, egg-free bread and the soy nut butter on it, and he opened his sandwich like kids do and dropped it face first on the floor, and we had no backup lunch, so they had to call me, and I had to run something up, and he had to eat it later. So I think having a safe meal or two in the event of an emergency is a great idea. But as far as the treat box, I feel that when parents provide that, you are pretty much inviting the teacher or allowing or condoning the teacher to be passing out snacks in the classroom where your child will not be able to participate. So I do like to say, you know, if you feel like that's working well, fine, but you're saying here that you already had the 504 meeting. I also think sometimes parents will say, well, you know, he's okay, he doesn't mind, he actually likes his safe box of things, and that's fine. And you know what, in my experience, that can happen, but around second or third grade, when the urge to merge is very, very strong, to be like everyone else, to fit in, most of these kids don't want to be different. So they will either refuse the snack altogether or they just will forego the treat altogether. So it's something to think about.
Thank you. Several questions kind of in this vein. Can the school refuse to evaluate my child for Section 504 plan?
Yes, they can, technically. We rarely hear about that anymore. Even as, you know, 3 or 4 years ago, we would hear that occasionally. But if they refuse to evaluate, they have to notify you of their decision, and they also have to notify you of your procedural rights or your procedural safeguards that tell you how you can appeal that decision. I would add that be sure, a lot of times when people say they're ignoring me or they're not, they've refused me, be sure that it's not a conversation. Be sure that you have put your request into writing. Again, always erring on the side of a more formal approach. We've heard from parents who say they've asked for a 504 thinking that, you know, just having a casual conversation is enough. These administrators have so much on their plates. They have so much going on. They're juggling many, many different balls, and that doesn't mean that your 504 is not important. It is. But when something is important, as Attorney Pete Wright says, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. So make your request formally. An email usually will suffice, but if you want to type up a letter and deliver it to the school requesting that your child be evaluated for 504, I would really recommend a more formal approach.
Gina, you talked a little bit about bus issues, but what about the bus? So this person says, my son's school says they cannot train drivers because they're a separate company that they contract with. How can I let my son on the bus without a trained adult?
So Definitely the bus is an issue that needs to be handled. And when a student has a disability, there are often special needs regarding transportation. And so when you're working through your 504 process, your child's unique needs need to be examined by the 504 team. Okay, this is really a team decision on what is needed. So if, for example, again, you want it to be individual. Is this a child who has, quote, only food allergies? Are we dealing with some other developmental issues? Are we dealing with some other health issues? In some cases, there may be an aid involved. And in my experience, in most cases, schools will end up finding a trained driver, whether it's ultimately the entire bus company is trained, everybody's trained on how to administer an epinephrine auto-injector, how to recognize the signs and symptoms of anaphylaxis. In other cases, there may be a special need for different transportation. Usually that's not the case. So when the school comes back to you and says, you know, we can't do that because we contract with, it may be innocent. I mean, we're all human beings, and I would really encourage you in working with your school, like officials and administrators, don't make them them. We as allergy parents, we don't like to be marginalized. We don't like people to roll their eyes at us or whatever. So, you know, look at this and just think that it may be just an innocent thing where they're saying, hey, we can't do that. They're just not thinking. You can offer helpful suggestions, but if a trained driver is needed for your child to be transported safely, it's really the district's responsibility to determine how to make that happen. Now, the team can talk together about what the best option is. Is it an aide? Is it a trained driver? But this really ultimately is something that the school needs to take care of. And as I mentioned before, many districts are now requiring their drivers, whether they're contracted or not, to be trained to administer epinephrine in the event of an emergency. And also, you want to make sure that you have what probably is a separate emergency care plan for transportation, because this will be slightly different. What you'll do in the event of an emergency right at school will be different than what you would do when you were handling an emergency as your child is transported to and from school. Make sure they have communication available as well.
Thanks, Gina. So you talked about the different laws and regulations that apply. This just maybe a little bit of a deeper dive here for this question. But my son's school says they won't do a 504 because it does not affect learning. Do food allergies have to affect learning to be covered by a 504 plan?
Yeah, no. The answer is no. And we still hear this a fair amount. And I think this is just really schools not understanding, because schools will actually put this in writing, which is kind of surprising to me. The Office for Civil Rights, who again under the Department of Education oversees 504, has a frequently asked question document on 504 plans. It's called Protecting Students with Disabilities. Perhaps we can get some links when we send out the recording for this. So again, if you Google 504 OCR and disabilities, you'll come up with this document, which is frequently asked questions called Protecting Students with Disabilities. And they address this very issue. What we're looking for is a health issue that substantially impacts any major life activity. And in the case of food allergies, eating is obviously affected. But when you look at this when it is active, when an allergic reaction is active, breathing is affected, you know, immune system is affected, respiratory system is affected, gastrointestinal may be affected. So there's multiple systems that could be impacted during allergic reaction. So no, learning does not need to be impacted in order to get a 504 plan.
Great. We're still pretty good on time here. So at kindergarten registration, the nurse said we don't need a 504 plan because they handle food allergies all the time. I kept telling her that I want a 504, but I still don't have one yet. What should I do?
Okay. Now, again, take it with a grain of salt, because this is kind of the old school approach where the school nurse writes a healthcare plan. But we know that when an allergy or allergies constitute a disability, and that child needs or may need services, that there needs to be an evaluation for a 504 plan. So it may just be, you know, as we said before, these school administrators, including the school nurse, are dealing with so many different things. It may just be that they're not aware. So rather than having that conversation with the nurse, you can take responsibility and you can request an evaluation for Section 504 plan. But that would be made, again, in writing, and that would be made to the principal. And, as a courtesy, you may just let her know. My understanding is that my child's health issue does constitute a disability. So I'm going to go ahead and request a 504 plan. We'll still need either the emergency care plan or the health care portion that talks about how you would recognize and treat a reaction. So definitely want to work with you on this, but I am going to go ahead and request that 504 plan from Principal Smith.
Great, thank you. I've got time for about 2 or 3 more. During my daughter's 504 meeting, the principal seemed to agree to most everything we wanted, but they said that they will give my child an IEP instead of a 504. Have you ever heard of this? Should I fight for the 504 plan?
Well, I wouldn't think in terms of fighting it, on anything. I really, again, would encourage you of just looking at school administrators and everybody across the table as people doing their job and just coming to the table with the best possible attitude. And again, I personally used Pete Wright's book, From Emotions to Advocacy, to really get my head in a good place as far as learning how to deal and communicate with very busy school administrators. So I would recommend that. You could certainly ask for clarification. There may be other issues that the school is considering that for some reason cause them to believe that an IEP is more appropriate for accommodating your child. I can't really say for sure. If there are other issues that may be, and schools do get some funding for IEP versus a 504, which is not funded, so I'm not sure if that could be a factor there. In the range of problems that we hear about, this one would not concern. I have heard of this before. It's unusual, though. In the range of problems that we hear about, it wouldn't concern me as much as some others we hear about, because the IEP does offer many protections, particularly if, like you said, the team is agreeing on the range of accommodations that you're seeking. So it's not common, but you could certainly ask for clarification and see if they have other reasons that you may not have thought of.
Thank you. All right, the next one, my daughter's in 2nd grade. We had a couple questions kind of along this line. The peanut-free table never really worked well. This year she wants to sit with her friends. Does she have to sit at the peanut-free table? So people were asking questions about we want to avoid isolation. So could you just touch a little bit on the peanut-free table issue?
Sure. So again, if a child has a disability, they're entitled to a free, appropriate public education, which is referred to as FAPE, in the least restrictive environment, often called LRE. So if your child I would ask if your daughter has a 504 plan, and hopefully so. And if so, you can discuss this issue with your child's allergist and pediatrician. If if he or she agrees that it's appropriate, you can certainly ask for an additional letter from your allergist stating that your daughter is mature enough to sit with her peers. And if there need to be additional accommodations now because she doesn't have the security of the peanut-free table, does she need to have something else done? Do they need to wipe down the table in a certain way? Is there something else? I mean, you're moving from a more restrictive to a less restrictive environment, and that's totally fine, especially developmentally if she's ready for that. But what else do they need to do? There may be another accommodation that you now need so that we make sure that this is safe. If your looks like your child was allergic to peanuts, so if that's the case, let's make sure that the table is clean or whatever else needs to be done. Does it need to be a certain table? Things like that. So when you're moving from more restrictive to less restrictive, just make sure, and I think that's an appropriate step down. I think most kids certainly by 3rd grade want to move away from that. They want to be integrated with their peers, and if it's safe, that's great. So again, your child is entitled to be in the least restrictive environment, but work with your school. A lot of times, and if you don't have a 504, it may be time to ask for them so that you have that power and those procedural safeguards, and you have a right to sit down and be part of the team that determines what's appropriate for your daughter at every step of the way.
Thank you, Gina. I'm going to ask you just one more, and then we're going to preview next week. So can you talk a little bit about the transfer of this on to college? Can a 504 transfer to college? I bring this up because for those of you not familiar with it, FAIR is working on a college food allergy program, and we're working on some of these guidelines. But Gina, I just want to get your
Sure.
take on moving into college.
Sure. So in a public school, the standard is a little bit different in K through 12. It's a little bit different for 504. The accommodations need to be the maximum extent appropriate. So no matter how severe the disability is, schools have to find a way to accommodate at the maximum extent appropriate. In post-secondary or college schools, the standard is a little bit different. It's reasonable accommodations. So it may be slightly less than what you would find in K through 12 school. You can have a Section 504 plan in college. Like I said, it will be different. In K through 12 schools, the schools actually have an affirmative obligation to seek out and identify children who may be disabled and may need services. In college, that's not the case. A college student with a disability or a food allergy that constitutes a disability needs to identify themselves and work with the school on what they may need. So it's a little bit different in how you identify that. In reality, in my experience, most kids, even in K through 12, the parent is actually approaching the school. We see a little bit more of schools seeking out through Child Find, but usually it's unfortunately after a situation about a reaction happens. But in college, it's on the student to identify themselves as a child. So again, we are strongly recommending, and especially through our college program, that the students approach this more formally, that they contact disability services, and every time we do that, more and more schools, more and more universities are aware that there is this need. And obviously there really is a need, especially in college. A lot of us K through 12 have taken on most of the burden. A lot of our kids pack lunch. You know, they certainly don't have to buy every day. But in college, it's very different. And if these colleges are not up to snuff and if they don't know how to serve food safely or prepare food safely, our kids are vulnerable. So it's really important that you lean toward a much more formal approach and formally identify yourself as a student with a disability who needs accommodations in the residence hall or the cafeteria or beyond.
Thank you very much, Gina. Great job. Got lots of questions. I've given my email out to a lot of folks as well, but we'll follow up afterwards. But really informative, Gina, so thank you very much for doing this.
Sure, it's my pleasure.